Everyone knows the story of Rorke's Drift, the desperate last stand of a few hundred soldiers. But just miles away, a far longer and possibly worse struggle was happening. For over 2 months, a group of about 1,700 British and colonial soldiers were trapped deep in enemy territory, completely surrounded by the Zulu kingdom. They weren't just fighting warriors. They were fighting starvation, disease, and their own growing fear. This is the story of the Siege of Eshowe, a forgotten epic of survival where the deadliest enemy wasn't a spear, but the sickness spreading inside a makeshift fort. It's a daily struggle for survival in a pressure cooker of mud, rain, and fear against completely impossible odds. It's January 1879. The British Empire, feeling pretty confident about itself, has declared war on the Zulu kingdom in southern Africa. The British High Commissioner, Sir Bartle Frere, decided the Zulus were a threat to colonial stability. So, he started a war, confident that modern guns and discipline would make it a quick fight. The plan made by Lieutenant General Lord Chelmsford was a 3-part invasion aimed straight at the Zulu capital Ulundi. One of these parts, the No. 1 column, was led by Colonel Charles Knight Pearson. His mission was simple: march into Zululand from the coast, build a fortified supply base at an old mission station called Eshowe, and wait for the next phase. It was supposed to be a straightforward march. It turned out to be anything but. Colonel Charles Pearson was a career soldier, a veteran of the Crimean War who was seen as a steady and reliable commander, if not a spectacular one. His column was a mixed group of the colonial army. He had his own regular British infantry, the Buffs, and companies of the 99th Regiment. Marching alongside them was a tough-as-nails naval brigade, sailors and Royal Marines pulling 2 cannons, a Gatling gun, and rocket tubes. Then you had various colonial volunteer units, mounted infantry, and 2 battalions of the Native Contingent or NNC, local African troops whose reliability was a constant worry for their British officers. All told, it was a force of around 5,000 men, including hundreds of civilian wagon drivers trying to manage a ridiculously long supply train. On January 12, 1879, Pearson's column started the miserable task of crossing the swollen Tugela River into Zululand. It took 2 full days. Once across, they set up a base, and on January 18th began marching inland. The trek was brutal. There were no roads, just rough tracks. The summer heat was suffocating, and the constant rivers and streams slowed the wagons to a crawl. The air was thick with tension. As one captain recalled, they took every precaution, guarding their flanks and turning their camp into a defensive circle every single night. They knew they were being watched. The Zulus were masters of their homeland, and their intelligence network was second to none. While the British saw empty hills, Zulu scouts shadowed their every move, reporting back to their king, Setchwale. The king was a sharp strategist, and had no intention of just letting the British walk to his capital. He sent a portion of his army, the Impi, to deal with each of the 3 columns. While his main force of over 20,000 warriors moved to intercept Chelmsford's central column, a smaller but still powerful army of about 6,000 was sent to stop Pearson. The collision happened on the morning of January 22nd. Pearson's column was camped near the Nizane River when a few Zulus were spotted on a high ridge. Thinking it was just a small nuisance, a company of the NNC was sent to chase them off. It was a trap. As the NNC advanced, the top of the ridge suddenly erupted into a living wave of black shields and flashing spears. The main Zulu force rose up and charged down the hill. The outgunned and terrified NNC broke and ran, leaving their European officers to face the attack alone. Down in the camp, the sound of gunfire kicked everyone into action. Pearson, though surprised, reacted like the professional he was. A firing line was scrambled together. The naval brigade rushed their artillery and the terrifying new Gatling gun to a small hill with a clear field of fire. As the Zulus charged, they were slammed by a devastating crossfire. The disciplined volleys of Martini Henry rifles, the shells from the cannons, and the rapid mechanical hammering of the Gatling gun tore through their ranks. For all their incredible bravery, the warriors just couldn't get close. They faltered and then fell back, leaving around 350 of their dead behind. Pearson's column lost 10 killed and 16 wounded. The Battle of Zane was a decisive British victory. It seemed to prove all their beliefs about the superiority of European firepower. But that very same day, just 60 miles away, that illusion was being shattered in the most horrific way imaginable. Pearson, not knowing about the disaster happening elsewhere, was feeling confident. His men had passed their first test. The next day, January 23rd, they marched the final few miles to their objective, the small deserted mission station at Eshowe. The Eshowe mission station sat on a wide plateau nearly 2,000 feet above sea level. It had a few simple but solid brick buildings, a church, a schoolhouse, and a home surrounded by a lovely garden and orange trees. It was a little slice of Europe in the middle of the Zulu landscape. But tactically it was a problem. It was overlooked on 3 sides by low hills, all well within rifle range. For now those spirits were high. Pearson set his men to work, turning the mission into the fortified depot he'd been ordered to build. They started digging trenches and piling up earthworks. On January 25th, feeling secure, he sent a convoy of empty wagons back to the river for more supplies. It was a routine decision that would have huge consequences. Those men would be the last to get out. Then on January 27th, a runner arrived with a mysterious and deeply disturbing message from Lord Chelmsford. It said Pearson should ignore all previous orders and do whatever he thought best to save his column. He should also know, it warned, that he might be attacked by the entire Zulu army. The message was terrifying for what it didn't say. There was no mention of the main army, no word of a great victory, just a vague, ominous warning. Pearson was confused, but he knew one thing: something had gone terribly, horribly wrong. The next day, another messenger brought the whole unbelievable truth. On January 22nd, the same day as the fight at Zane, the main Zulu army had wiped out Lord Chelmsford's central column at Isandlwana. In just a few hours, over 1,300 British and colonial soldiers were dead. It was the single greatest disaster of the Victorian military era, a shockwave felt across the entire British Empire. For the men at Eshowe, the news was a gut punch. They were no longer the proud advance force of a victorious army. They were a tiny, isolated island in a hostile sea. The main invasion was gone. The Zulus, fresh off their stunning victory, could now turn their full attention on them. The men at Eshowe were completely, utterly alone. Pearson faced a terrible choice. Chelmsford had given him permission to retreat. He could try a fighting march back to the Tugela River, but it would be a 40-mile ordeal, chased by a triumphant Zulu army. He'd have to abandon his wounded and supplies, and it would look like a panicked flight, possibly encouraging a Zulu invasion of the natal colony. The other option was to stay, dig in, fortify the mission, and hold out, praying a relief force could eventually be sent. It was a massive gamble. They had no idea when or even if help would come. Pearson gathered his senior officers. The decision was made. They would stay. They would turn the little mission into a fortress and defy the entire Zulu kingdom. The siege of Eshowe had begun. That decision changed everything. The easygoing pace of work exploded into frantic, desperate energy. Every man knew his life now depended on the strength of the walls they were building. The man in charge of this massive project was Captain Wynne of the Royal Engineers. Under his command, the sleepy mission was carefully turned into a strong fortress. They laid out a perimeter, a rough rectangle about 200 yards long by 50 yards wide, enclosing the church and other buildings. Thousands of men went to work digging a deep, wide ditch. The dirt from the ditch was piled up on the inside to create a thick parapet, a 6-foot-high wall of packed earth reinforced with sandbags, biscuit boxes, and anything else they could find. They cut loopholes into the wall, creating thousands of firing positions. The mission buildings became part of the defense. The sturdy church became the central keep and hospital, its windows sandbagged and its small tower serving as the main lookout post. Inside the fort, supply wagons were arranged into smaller defensive circles, creating fallback positions. But Captain Wynne's creativity went beyond just walls. The ground outside the ditch was turned into a death trap. They wove sharpened branches into dense barriers called abatis. They laid wire entanglements to trip up attackers. And most cruelly, they dug wolf pits, deep holes with a sharpened stake at the bottom, cleverly hidden under a thin layer of grass. Any Zulu attack would have to cross this nightmare obstacle course while under a constant hail of gunfire. Finally, they cleared the field of fire, leveling everything for up to 800 yards to deny the Zulus any cover. The work was relentless and backbreaking. And soon, large groups of Zulus began to appear on the surrounding hills, just watching. A force of up to 5,000 warriors commanded by local chiefs and one of King Setshwayo's half-brothers had them surrounded. The king, having learned the brutal cost of storming a fort at Rorke's Drift, had given clear orders: don't attack. Instead, they were to surround Eshowe, cut it off, and starve the British out. For the first and only time in the war, a British column with modern weapons was being held in a classic siege by an army of warriors armed mostly with spears. The fort, now officially named Fort Eshowe, was ready. All they could do was wait. As January turned into February, the grim reality of the siege set in. Life inside Fort Eshowe became a boring, soul-crushing routine. The excitement was gone, replaced by a grim struggle against enemies both outside and inside the walls. Outside, the Zulus kept up their patient blockade. They rarely offered a large target, having learned their lesson at Niazane. Instead, they played mind games. Zulu marksmen, some using rifles captured at Isanluana, would sneak into position and take pot shots at anyone foolish enough to show themselves. At night, the haunting sound of war cries would echo from the hills, a psychological tactic designed to shred the garrison's nerves. Sometimes they'd shout taunts. "Mind and take care of our king's cattle," they'd yell, referring to the garrison's livestock. "We're soon coming for them." To fight the boredom, Colonel Pearson would organize occasional raids, as much to keep his men busy as to gather information. But the most dangerous enemies were the ones they couldn't shoot. First was the weather. The rains came and just didn't stop. The fort turned into a swamp of thick, sticky mud. Most men slept under wagons on the soaked ground. Nothing was ever dry. Then came the hunger. Rations were cut immediately. The standard biscuit and salted meat went bad in the damp. Private John Cooper of the 99th Regiment remembered it clearly. "The biscuit we were given went green with mold, and the salt meat was crawling with maggots before we got it to the pot. Still, we ate what we could. Tea, sugar, and tobacco ran out. Foraging parties would risk sniper fire to collect wild spinach. Eventually, they had to slaughter the oxen, then the horses and mules. Worst of all was the disease. In the cramped, filthy conditions, sickness was inevitable. Dysentery and typhoid fever spread like wildfire. The small church hospital was soon overflowing. Medical supplies, especially quinine, were quickly used up. On February 1st, a private became the first man to die of sickness. He wouldn't be the last. Funerals became a daily routine, often conducted under long-range Zulu fire. The sick list swelled to over 200. The men grew thin, pale, and weak. As one soldier recalled, "The hospital huts were full and we buried men almost every day." Disease. Amid the misery, a flicker of hope. One day in early March, a flash of light was spotted on a distant hill. It was a heliograph, a mirror flashing sunlight in Morse code. The relief force 22 miles away was trying to make contact. The men in Eshowe desperately jury-rigged their own heliograph with a shaving mirror and a telescope lens. Communication was established. They learned that a relief column was being assembled and would march on April 1st. For the exhausted, sickly garrison, it was the news they desperately needed, a reason to hold on. Back in Natal, Lord Chelmsford was a disgraced man. Isanluana had destroyed his army and his reputation. Now he was driven by one thing: redemption. And that started with rescuing Pearson's men. He scraped together a powerful relief force of over 5,600 men, heavily armed with artillery and Gatling guns. There would be no mistakes this time. On March 29th, the new army started its march. The advance was painfully slow. Haunted by Isanluana, Chelmsford took zero chances, building a heavily fortified camp every single night. By the evening of April 1st, the lookouts in the Eshowe church tower could see the flickering campfires of the relief column just 10 miles away. Hope was in sight. But the Zulus weren't done. King Setchweo had sent a massive impi of around 12,000 warriors, including veterans from Isanluwana, to intercept and destroy Chelmsford's force. At dawn on April 2nd, the British were camped near a place called Jinjinlovu. As the morning mist lifted, an officer spotted what he thought was a line of dark bushes on a ridge. A scout next to him pointed and said one chilling word: "Impi." The Zulus attacked at a run, trying to encircle the camp just as they had at Isanluwana. But Chelmsford was ready. His men were entrenched. Their ammunition was piled high, and their fields of fire were clear. When the warriors got within 300 yards, the British unleashed a storm of lead. The disciplined volleys, the thunder of the artillery, and the mechanical slaughter of the Gatling guns shredded the Zulu ranks. For 20 minutes, the Zulus charged with incredible courage, but they just couldn't break through. Seeing the attack falter, Chelmsford sent his mounted troops charging out of the camp. The battle turned into a rout. The Zulu army was broken, leaving over 1,000 dead on the field. British casualties were just 2 killed and about 50 wounded. From their hilltop fort, the men at Eshowe could hear the distant roar of the battle and see the puffs of cannon smoke. With breathless anxiety, they watched the fight unfold, with Colonel Pearson actually signaling the outcome to Chelmsford before the general himself knew the full result. The path was clear. The next day, April 3rd, the relief column marched the final miles. As they approached Fort Eshowe, the pipers of the 91st Highlanders began playing. "The Campbells are coming." The sound drifted up to the exhausted garrison. Men too weak with fever to stand crawled to see. As the relief column marched into the fort, the siege was finally over. Grown men, gaunt and hollow-eyed, wept with relief. They had been surrounded for roughly 70 days. They had held on. The rescue was a sobering moment. The relief force was shocked by the state of the garrison. The men were skeletons in rags, their faces etched with trauma. As one observer put it, they were born to ghosts. Of the roughly 1,700 people trapped in the fort, about 80 had died. Critically, the vast majority of those deaths, records suggest around 25 of the 28 buried there, were not from Zulu spears, but from disease. More would die from their sicknesses even after being evacuated. Chelmsford decided Eshowe served no more purpose and was too hard to resupply. He ordered the fort abandoned. The men who had spent over 2 months building and defending their prison were now told to tear it down. On April 6th, the combined force marched back to the river. That night, they looked back and saw the sky glowing red. The Zulus had set the abandoned mission ablaze. The engineering genius of the defense, Captain Wynne, was one of the casualties. Worn out by his immense labor, he had fallen ill during the siege. Too weak to march, he was carried in a cart and died on his 36th birthday, buried on a hillside overlooking the river. So what was the point of it all? Strategically, the siege of Eshowe achieved very little. It was a holding action that ended right back where it started. And yet, its significance was huge. In the dark days after the national trauma of Isanluwana, the story of Eshowe was a beacon of hope. It was a testament to British grit and engineering. For over 2 months, a small force had held out deep in enemy territory, tying down thousands of Zulu warriors. The endurance of Pearson's men gave a crucial morale boost to the British Army and the public back home. The siege of Eshowe isn't a story of a single glorious battle. It's a story of slow, grinding, day-by-day survival against hunger, boredom, despair, and disease. It reminds us that in war, the greatest struggles are often the quiet, desperate ones fought far from the clash of steel. It is the forgotten epic of the Anglo Zulu War, a 70-day ordeal that pushed its survivors to their absolute limit. The siege of Eshowe is just one of many forgotten stories of endurance from history that deserve to be remembered. If you found this story of survival against the odds compelling, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into the overlooked corners of military history. And let us know in the comments, what other forgotten sieges or battles do you think we should cover next? Thanks for watching. The defense of Fort Eshowe is a fascinating counterpoint to the more famous battles of the Anglo Zulu War. Isanlewina was a story of shock and failure, and Rorke's Drift a tale of a brief, intense, and heroic defense. Eshowe, though, was a marathon of misery. It highlights the brutal challenges of colonial warfare and the grim reality that in many 19th-century campaigns, sickness was a far deadlier killer than combat. The men who survived those long days weren't heroes of a grand charge, but they were survivors of an ordeal that tested the very limits of human resilience. Their story is a powerful reminder that victory isn't always measured in ground gained, but sometimes in simply having the strength to walk away.